Please become a patron of Myth Vision Podcast. Get access to everything early. Help us grow. Ian Mills, a PhD student or candidate at Duke University. I hope you get the PhD sometime soon, my friend.
Me too.
Go subscribe to his channel. That is the New Testament Review Podcast. Make sure you guys go check him out. It's in the description. Hit that like button on all his content. I'm learning from him today. And today, I guess we're going to talk about the topic of the Gospel of Thomas, which I personally think is just mind-boggling. Just for many reasons. And I'm going to let you lead with this because you're the guy who's been really reading this, but I have like a few things I might bring up throughout the conversation.
Absolutely. I love the Gospel according to Thomas. It is again, we talked about the concept of Gnosticism and how that's a fuzzy, complicated, difficult topic. This would also fit into that bucket. Go back and look at the Gospel according to Mary video. Gospel of Thomas we actually discovered the first fragments of this in the Oxyrhynchus digs back in the 19th century. But we didn't know what we had until the Nag Hammadi finds in the 1940s, when we discovered a collection of basically Gnostic texts, a little Gnostic library. And in that was a complete copy of the Gospel according to Thomas. And once we had that full text in Coptic, we realized that we'd actually recovered 3 other fragments in Greek of the Gospel according to Thomas some decades earlier. Now, the Gospel according to Thomas is not a story of the life of Jesus, just the way that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are. It is instead a collection of 114 sayings of Jesus. These are sometimes called logia, but they're just sayings. It fits into a genre probably of philosophical literature we find in antiquity called the Creia collection. And that's a collection of sayings and like very, very brief episodes, like brief stories, just sort of teachings of Jesus one after another, in this case, teachings of a philosopher one after another. And so it does have a context. It does fit into a genre of ancient philosophical literature. And this is probably significant, again, going back to think about what is Gnosticism. If Gnosticism is just sort of the Platonic culture, the Platonic philosophy of the day, being sort of integrated in different ways, according to different schemes with Christian thought, this is more evidence of that. They're using a philosophical genre. It's also maybe worth noting that the only non-Christian text, or one of the only non-Christian texts that was found in Nag Hammadi with the Gospel of Thomas, was Plato's Republic. So strong evidence that that's what's going on. So what does the Gospel of Thomas teach you? Well, the Gospel of Thomas says these are the secret sayings of Jesus given to Didymus Judas Thomas, that Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down. So they're secret sayings, which implies probably there are public sayings. So this is a subset of the total of Jesus' teachings. And I think that's really, really important, because I think there are some of the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas that are assuming your knowledge with the non-secret teachings of Jesus. So these are the secret teachings of Jesus. And the Gospel of Thomas begins, whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death. So how do you get salvation, according to Thomas? You find the interpretation of Jesus' teachings. Now, there are strains of proto-Orthodox, of other non-Gnostic kinds of Christianity that place a lot of emphasis on the salvific importance of Jesus' teachings. The Gospels themselves describe Jesus, the canonical Gospels, as being a teacher, as coming to reveal the Father. Matthew and Luke have this Johannine thunderbolt people think of. That, of course, is part of the Christian tradition all along. But the Gospel of Thomas places all of its emphasis right here. The way to salvation is not faith in Christ's death and resurrection. The way to salvation is not necessarily even the incarnation of Jesus. The way to salvation is finding the interpretation of Jesus' teachings. And perhaps what I think is a sort of programmatic summary of Jesus' teachings, according to the Gospel of Thomas, is saying 3. Look, your leaders. Now, it's not a little unclear. That could be if this is supposed to be like Mark, Matthew, and Luke, that could be the Jewish leaders. That could be the Jesus' usual rivals. Jesus, of course, himself is also Jewish, but the leadership of the temple, and it could be them. It could also be Christian leaders. I think that's a real possibility here. But your leaders will say, look, the kingdom is in the sky, but if that's true, the birds will precede you. They'll say, it's in the sea, but the fish will precede you. No, I say, but the kingdom is within you, and it is outside of you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will understand that you are children of the living Father. But if you will not know yourselves, then you are in poverty, and it is you who are the poverty. So what's the kingdom? It's inside of you, and you need to know yourself. That's what Thomas is going to teach throughout. And it's going to teach throughout that that's what matters, and that's the only thing that matters.
Interesting. Yeah, and I mean, he does this quite often. I kind of like that, though. That saying is actually kind of cool. Like, today, I always talk about that when I got clean from drugs. Like, I actually when I look back, like, didn't really know myself. I had a small voice inside, conscious speaking to myself, but I never really knew myself. And I always told people before I even read this book, didn't know about the Gospel of Thomas, was like, you just, once you get to know yourself and love yourself for who you are, you're good. But I don't know if that's part of this either. Like, they don't expect you to love yourself. You just got to know in some weird platonic way inside there's a spark, and it's, you know what I mean?
Right. It's this, I think for Thomas, it's this primordial light. It's this contrast of the world, of everything outside of you. You're supposed to ignore, even possibly your body, even, the parts of yourself that aren't this primordial light. You're supposed to neglect, ignore, for the sake of just pure self-knowledge, for contemplating this light, contemplating this ultimate truth.
I have to ask, in the vein of Thomas, because this goes to Mary as well, and other videos we're going to do. I suspect Gnosticism will find its way up. In the New Testament, we have like 1 John and other books that are obviously opposing such concepts, or they sound like, do not love the world. If you love the world, you don't have the love of God. That sounds like either that is, because that's later, it's a pastoral, or it's like the foundation in which they really built this Christian doctrine from. So we either say it's in the vein of Gnostic teaching, or it's like, this is right before they got insane with the teaching of Gnosticism or Gnostic ideas. Yeah,
some of this, so that's interesting. Even the language of the kingdom being within you and not outside of you type of thing, even that language has some precedent in the Gospel of Luke.
Right.
But the thing is, what they mean by those things, read within the context of the whole Gospel, seems to be radically different. So let's take Luke. Luke says, "In kingdoms within you," and there is this discussion of like you versus the world, although that's more typical of the Gospel of John, of course. But what does that mean for the Gospel of Luke? That means instead of seeking power, instead of advancing the kingdom in some like outward way, instead of caring about the affairs of the world, you should instead care for the poor and the marginalized. You should instead spend your time in prayer and fasting. You should instead go about preaching the kingdom of God. Right? That's what Luke wants you to do. To neglect the world, to focus on the kingdom, is to give up your wealth, to give up your power, to give up your privilege, to lay yourself down for the sake of others. What does it mean for the Gospel of Thomas? Well, the disciples come to Jesus and ask, should we pray? Should we fast? And Jesus says, no. Jesus teaches throughout the Gospel of Thomas that prayer, fast, and almsgiving, giving to the poor, is bad, is something you shouldn't do. Because that's the stuff of the world. That's the stuff that doesn't matter.
Wow.
And so you should put away all of that stuff. And there are some very clear instances of this. There are also some that are a little harder to interpret. There's this classic, you need to sabotage the Sabbath. You need to fast from the world. And probably reading those things in parallel, and this word sabotage is kind of strange, but probably what's being saying there is you need to, on the Sabbath, you abstain from things. You need to abstain from observing the Sabbath. You need to give up all of the things that other Christians, and in this case the Sabbath, followers of the Jewish law, you need to stop doing all of those things just to focus on this kingdom within. So that's a very different message.
Yeah.
And actually, my favorite example of the contrast between Thomas and Luke is this saying that's super hard to interpret of Jesus. Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas, "Be ye passerbys." Be someone who passes by. And there's no other context. There's nothing else to look to. This is just an isolated saying. So what is that all about? Well, there are several places, I think, where you read Thomas, and it is not only literarily dependent on the Synoptic Gospels, but it's commenting on them. It's doing a sort of commentary on the teachings of Jesus that you know. Because remember, Thomas is the secret teachings. You know the public teachings already. These are the secret teachings that you need to find the interpretation of. And I think, people like Mark Goodacre, Simon Gathercole have demonstrated just compellingly that Thomas for sure knows these texts. And I would suggest there's strong evidence that Thomas is expecting you to know these texts, you, dear reader. So, knowing that, who are passerbys? Be a passerby. There's a story of Jesus, a very well-known story of Jesus, that features people who pass by.
Oh.
The story, the so-called Good Samaritan story. In Luke, this is a story of someone gets robbed, gets beaten up and left on the side of the road. And the people that Luke's readership expect to be the good guys, the chief priest, the Pharisee, these people who are supposed to be our heroes, they walk by and ignore this person. And then comes along a Samaritan who is sort of, marginal, sort of, you're supposed to be skeptical of that person because Samaritans aren't, they're sort of, it's a complicated story, but the Samaritan...
ethnicity issue, right.
Yeah, I don't want to get too much into that because that's a really loaded thing.
Right.
But anyways, they're skeptical, and the Samaritan doesn't pass by, right? The Samaritan comes and takes care of the person on the side of the road and helps them. And Luke says, of course, you're supposed to be like the Samaritan. He was the neighbor. He is the one you're supposed to imitate. What does Thomas say? Remember Thomas, who says, don't give alms because alms is bad? Well, Thomas says, be a passerby. Thomas says, you're supposed to walk by. You're supposed to ignore the person because tying yourself up with the person on the side of the road, tying yourself up with almsgiving, with fasting, tying yourself up with caring about the poor and the marginalized, that's getting yourself complicated with the stuff that doesn't matter. You are supposed to focus instead on the kingdom within. And the primordial light and the sort of like image of Jesus. And so you were supposed to just care about knowledge and you should be a passerby.
This really is fascinating. I never knew that, and it makes me think of the Lazarus rich man story as well. Like, it sounds like Thomas is actually arguing against
That's right.
very source we want to say. Which brings up, and I don't want to go into this, I just want to make the comment for everyone, Marcion having a supposed different version of Luke. And it makes me wonder if Gospel of Thomas, there's something that Marcion might, because I know he was rich historically. Mm-hmm. I don't know if he was taking the Lucan ideas and incorporating those into his life, or the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas ideas, and I don't know.
I'd love to talk about the relationship of Marcion's Gospel, Luke's Gospel. Maybe we can do another video on that.
Okay.
But I do want to, I don't think, it's hard to say that Thomas knows Marcion versus Marcion knows Thomas. That's a whole complicated conversation. But there is another parallel between those two texts, which is that Thomas says, there are 27 prophets in Israel, and they are dead. I'm alive. You should be focusing on me. That's a paraphrase. I don't know exactly what the saying is. But Thomas explicitly rejects the prophets. Thomas says, the Hebrew scriptures, those are dead. Those are not what's important.
Wow.
You need to focus on my teaching. And that's another parallel between, that is a parallel, I suppose, between Marcion and Thomas. That said, Marcion seems to have been interested in taking care of the poor. So Marcion wasn't a Gnostic. You can go watch our video about that.
That's really interesting you bring that up. I got to ask one more because I came out of the sect of full preterism. I don't know why I call it a sect. It's really just like a theological, mental gymnastics type of, I guess you'd say like a study type of Christianity. But it is different from Orthodoxy. They are heretics by Orthodox standards. And I just say that for everybody who's not aware. They believe the second coming of Jesus did happen. in 70 AD.
Sure.
The destruction of Jerusalem, 70 AD, that's it. The resurrection, the judgment, they will make everything harmonized to fit their particular view. They'll go to Revelation, for example, make that, they'll make like, for once to die and then the judgment. Well, no, the judgment happened in 70 in this world. It can't happen after death. So they want to harmonize things that may not belong.
Okay.
I say that to say the resurrection. We go to the Gospel of Thomas. When will the repose of the dead take place there, my friend?
Gospel of Thomas has almost nothing on this. The Gospel of Thomas doesn't seem to discuss this hardly at all. There is this random saying, 11, I think. This will, there is an acknowledgement that this was part of the Jesus tradition, that the heaven and earth will pass away type of thing. But it doesn't seem to be Thomas's point. Thomas appropriates it for other purposes.
The whole resurrection of the dead thing, though, I was going to say, like, when they asked him, the disciples say, when will the resurrection of the dead take place, the repose? And he says, look around.
Yeah.
It's already happened.
Right.
So I think he's, like, cutting through, like, they're still concerning. Once again, where's this body? Where are we going to be, like, people are going to rise from the dead? Look at all these dead people in the faith, or whatever it might be. Who knows the context? I'm probably feeding something that may not be there. But he is interpreting it.
That's right.
In a different way, like, stop.
I see your point. Yes. No, that's right. The apocalyptic language of Jesus that we find, say, in Mark 13, that we find in the Synoptic Gospels, and the sort of apocalyptic expectation of Paul, for Thomas, is all located in Jesus. Jesus, the kingdom of heaven is something that's within you. It's something that's already happened. It's not something you're looking forward to as an expectation. It is already a reality.
Which is the resurrection, everything.
Yes, right. That's right. Which, again, is not the position of orthodoxy.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I just had to ask because I don't know why the full preterists don't run to this text to try and validate. Yeah. But then again, it goes outside of the canon.
I was going to say, because it's been, it's a very heretical text.
That's true.
According to the traditional conceptions of Orthodox Christianity.
We could go on and on in that text of getting other sayings and, trying to decipher what it's saying. But my last question would be on that is just, when do we date it? I've seen anywhere online where people say 70 80 up to 140 80, right. But it's still early. That's still a text that's kind of early.
Yeah. It probably, we don't have a lot of external evidence for dating this thing. It has to have, Hippolytus of Rome knows the text. It has to be sometime in the 2nd century, probably. But being more specific than that is really difficult. We just have to do it on relative dating. Mm-hmm. So Thomas, I think, indubitably knows Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Thomas, I think, knows Paul. And I think, this is something I'm hoping to publish on someday, Thomas, and other people have provided other evidence for this, but I think there's some evidence people haven't noticed, that Thomas knows the Gospel of John. And if the Gospel of John, so now we're sort of stacking up hypotheses to try to date something, but I think the Gospel of John knows Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and so you're sort of pushing yourself back. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's really hard to see the Gospel of Thomas being composed before 120. Because just based on how I'm going to date Luke, and then how I'm going to date John coming after that, and then Thomas having all of them, or having at least most of them, probably in the early 2nd century at the earliest, and sometime after that then.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
Yep.